In a city torn by racial tensions, an act of police brutality ignites a firestorm of controversy. When Captain John Blake's violent encounter with pregnant Maya Johnson goes viral, her husband, Senator Daniel Johnson, leads a movement for justice. And if you love your family and want to hear more incredible stories like this one, subscribe to our channel. The air in the neighborhood was thick with tension as Captain John Blake conducted his routine patrol. Years of experience had hardened him, making him feel invincible in his position of authority. The streets were quiet, but Blake could sense the underlying current of resentment from the residents. He adjusted his belt, feeling the weight of his badge and gun, symbols of the power he wielded. As Blake turned a corner, he spotted a group of young men loitering near a convenience store. His instincts, honed by years on the force, kicked in. He approached the group, his hand resting casually on his holster. "Evening, gentlemen," he called out, his voice carrying a hint of challenge. "Mind if I ask what you're up to?" The group tensed visibly, exchanging glances. One of them, a tall young man with a defiant look in his eyes, stepped forward. "We're just talking, officer. Is that a crime now?" Blake's jaw tightened. He'd heard that tone before, the barely concealed contempt for authority. It was a dance he knew all too well. "Spread out, hands where I can see them," he ordered, his voice sharp. As the group reluctantly complied, a woman rounded the corner, her pregnant belly clearly visible. Maya Johnson, wife of Senator Daniel Johnson, had been on her way home from a late-night craving run. She paused, taking in the scene before her. "Is there a problem here, officer?" Maya asked, her voice calm but firm. Blake turned, irritation flashing in his eyes. "Ma'am, please step back. This doesn't concern you." Maya stood her ground. "These are my neighbors. I think it does concern me." The tension in the air ratcheted up a notch. Blake, feeling his authority challenged, took a step towards Maya. "I said, step back," he barked. What happened next would change the course of many lives. In a moment of unchecked anger, Blake shoved Maya, hard. She stumbled backward, losing her balance and falling heavily to the ground. Time seemed to freeze. The young men watched in horror. Maya lay on the ground, clutching her belly, her face contorted in pain and shock. Blake, realizing the gravity of his action, stood paralyzed for a moment before his training kicked in. "Stay where you are," he shouted at the group, his voice betraying a hint of panic. Unbeknownst to Blake, a bystander had captured the entire incident on their phone. The video, showing a uniformed police officer pushing a visibly pregnant woman to the ground, would soon spread like wildfire across social media platforms. As sirens wailed in the distance responding to the commotion, the witness quietly slipped away, their phone containing footage that would spark outrage across the nation. The video began its journey through the digital landscape, shared and reshared, each view adding fuel to the fire of public indignation. Within hours, the hashtag #YoungJusticeForMaya began trending. The grainy footage, showing Maya's fall in excruciating detail, was played on loop on news channels. Social media exploded with anger, calls for Blake's immediate suspension echoing across platforms. The incident, lasting mere seconds, had set in motion a chain of events that would expose deep-seated issues within the police force and the community at large. As Maya was rushed to the hospital and Blake returned to the precinct to face an internal investigation, neither could have predicted the storm that was about to engulf their lives and the entire city. Senator Daniel Johnson's world came to a screeching halt as he watched the video on his phone. His wife, Maya, pushed to the ground by a police officer. The image played on repeat in his mind, each viewing stoking the fire of his rage and disbelief. "How dare he?" Daniel muttered, his fingers gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. He paced the length of his office, trying to process the information. His pregnant wife, the woman he had sworn to protect, had been assaulted by someone meant to serve and protect the community. Without wasting another moment, Daniel picked up his phone and started making calls. His voice, usually measured and diplomatic, now carried an edge of urgency and anger. "We need to meet, now," he told his chief of staff. Within an hour, Daniel's office was filled with a diverse group of individuals: community leaders, civil rights activists, and his most trusted advisors. The tension in the room was palpable as they gathered around a large conference table, the video of Maya's assault playing on a screen at the front of the room. "This isn't just about Maya," Daniel began, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside him. "This is about every person in our community who has ever felt powerless in the face of injustice. We need to act, and we need to act now." The room erupted in a chorus of voices, each person offering their perspective on the situation. Some called for immediate protests, others suggested legal action. The debate grew heated, reflecting the anger and frustration felt by many in the community. Amidst the cacophony, a young activist named Zoe stood up. "Senator," she said, her voice cutting through the noise, "we need to harness the power of social media. The video is already going viral, but we need to shape the narrative." Daniel nodded, recognizing the wisdom in her words. "What do you suggest?" "A hashtag," Zoe replied. "Something simple, powerful, that encapsulates what we're fighting for. Justice for Maya." The room fell silent for a moment, then erupted in murmurs of agreement. Daniel felt a glimmer of hope amidst his anger and worry. This was how they would make their voices heard. As the meeting continued, strategies were formed and tasks delegated. Daniel found himself at the center of a whirlwind of activity, his phone buzzing constantly with messages of support and media requests for interviews. Outside, the city was beginning to stir. The video of Maya's assault had struck a chord with people from all walks of life. It wasn't just about one incident anymore. It had become a rallying cry for those who had long felt voiceless. Social media platforms were flooded with the hashtag #IJusticeForMaya. People shared their own stories of encounters with law enforcement, creating a tapestry of experiences that painted a disturbing picture of systemic issues. Daniel watched as the movement grew, spreading beyond the confines of their city. Celebrities and politicians from across the country began to weigh in, amplifying the call for justice. The incident with Maya had become a catalyst, sparking a national conversation about police brutality and accountability. As night fell, Daniel finally allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. He stood by the window of his office, looking out at the city lights. The weight of responsibility settled heavily on his shoulders. This wasn't just about seeking justice for Maya anymore. It had become a fight for the soul of their community. His phone buzzed with a message from the hospital. Maya was stable, the baby unharmed. Daniel closed his eyes, offering a silent prayer of thanks. When he opened them, his reflection in the window stared back at him, determination etched in every line of his face. "We will not be silenced," he whispered to himself. A promise to Maya, to their unborn child, and to every person who had ever felt powerless in the face of injustice. The fight was just beginning, and Daniel Johnson was ready to lead the charge. Captain John Blake sat at his desk, staring blankly at the computer screen before him. The past 48 hours had been a whirlwind of activity, turning his world upside down. The video of him pushing Maya Johnson had gone viral, and now he found himself at the center of a storm he never saw coming. His email inbox was flooded with messages, some from fellow officers offering support, but many more containing threats and demands for his resignation. The sheer volume of vitriol directed at him was overwhelming. Blake rubbed his temples, feeling the onset of another headache. A knock on his office door jolted him from his thoughts. It was Sergeant Martinez, one of the few officers who hadn't been avoiding him like the plague. "Cap," Martinez said, his voice low, "the chief wants to see you." Blake nodded, steeling himself for what he knew would be an unpleasant conversation. As he walked through the precinct, he could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him. Some looked away quickly, while others stared openly, their expressions a mix of disappointment and anger. The meeting with the chief was brief and to the point. Blake was placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. As he cleaned out his locker, the reality of his situation began to sink in. His career, the only thing he had ever known, was hanging by a thread. Across town, Maya Johnson was dealing with her own aftermath. The physical pain from her fall had subsided, but the emotional trauma lingered. She sat in a circle of women, each with their own story of encounters with law enforcement gone wrong. "I never thought it would happen to me," Maya said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I mean, I'm married to a senator. I thought that would protect me somehow." The other women nodded in understanding. One of them, an older lady named Gloria, reached out and squeezed Maya's hand. "Honey, when it comes to this kind of thing, status doesn't matter. We're all vulnerable." As Maya listened to the stories of the other women, she felt a shift within herself. The fear and helplessness that had plagued her since the incident began to give way to something else, a sense of purpose. "We can't let this keep happening," she said, her voice growing stronger. "We need to speak out, to make our voices heard." The group murmured in agreement. They began to discuss ways to share their stories, to bring attention to the issue of police brutality. Maya found herself taking notes, her mind racing with ideas. Meanwhile, Blake was struggling to come to terms with the consequences of his actions. He sat in his living room, the TV muted but showing footage of protests happening downtown. His phone buzzed with another message, this time from his daughter. "Dad, what's going on? Are you okay?" The message read. Blake stared at the screen, unsure how to respond. How could he explain to his child that her father, the man she had always seen as a hero, was now being called a monster by thousands of people? As night fell, both Maya and Blake found themselves grappling with the new realities of their lives. Maya, energized by the support of her newfound sisterhood, began drafting a statement she would release to the press. She was no longer content to be just a victim. She would be a voice for change. Blake, on the other hand, felt more isolated than ever. The certainty that had always guided his actions as a police officer was crumbling, leaving him questioning everything he thought he knew. As the city buzzed with tension and anticipation of what was to come, neither Maya nor Blake could have predicted how their paths would continue to intersect, or how their actions in the coming days would shape the future of their community. The stage was set for a confrontation that would force both sides to examine their beliefs, their prejudices, and their capacity for change. The question remained, would justice prevail, or would the cycle of violence and mistrust continue unbroken? Senator Daniel Johnson stood at the head of a large conference table, surrounded by a diverse group of community leaders. The room hummed with energy as they discussed the upcoming march in support of Maya and against police brutality. "We need to make sure this march sends a clear message," Daniel said, his voice carrying the weight of determination. "It's not just about what happened to Maya, it's about systemic change." A local pastor, Reverend Williams, nodded in agreement. "We need to show unity. This isn't just a black issue or a white issue. It's a human rights issue." As the group debated logistics and messaging, Daniel couldn't help but feel a sense of purpose. This was why he had entered politics in the first place, to make a real difference in people's lives. Across town, Captain John Blake sat in his living room, the TV blaring news about the upcoming march. He felt a knot form in his stomach as he watched footage of people making signs and preparing for the event. His phone buzzed with a message from a fellow officer. "You watching this? They're coming after all of us now." Blake stared at the message, conflicting emotions warring within him. Part of him wanted to defend his actions, to stand firm in his belief that he had done nothing wrong. But another part, a part he was trying hard to ignore, whispered that maybe, just maybe, he had been in the wrong. As the day of the march approached, tension in the city reached a fever pitch. Local businesses boarded up their windows, fearing potential violence. The police department held emergency meetings, strategizing how to handle crowd control without escalating the situation. Daniel found himself at the center of a media storm. Interviews, press conferences, strategy meetings. His days blurred together in a whirlwind of activity. Through it all, he drew strength from Maya, who had thrown herself into organizing with a passion that both inspired and worried him. "Are you sure you're up for this?" he asked her one night, watching as she pored over march route maps. Maya looked up at him, her eyes blazing with determination. "I have to be," she said simply. "If not me, then who?" As the sun rose on the day of the march, the city held its breath. People began gathering at the designated starting point, their numbers swelling as the morning progressed. Signs bearing slogans like "Justice for Maya" and "End Police Brutality" dotted the crowd. Daniel and Maya stood at the front of the gathering, hands clasped tightly together. As Daniel prepared to address the crowd, he felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. "Today," he began, his voice carrying over the hushed crowd, "we march not just for Maya, but for every person who has ever felt the sting of injustice. We march for a future where our children can walk the streets without fear. We march for change." A roar went up from the crowd, a sound of agreement and solidarity that seemed to shake the very ground. As the march began to move through the city streets, Blake watched from the sidelines, dressed in civilian clothes. He had come, drawn by a mix of curiosity and a need to understand. As he watched the diverse crowd move past him, young and old, black and white, all united in their call for justice, he felt something shift inside him. The march proceeded peacefully for several blocks, the chants of the protesters echoing off the buildings. But as they approached the police precinct, the atmosphere changed. A line of officers in riot gear stood blocking the street, their presence a silent challenge to the marchers. Daniel felt Maya's hand tighten in his as they approached the police line. He could sense the crowd tensing behind him, the peaceful energy of before giving way to something more volatile. As they stood face to face with the officers, time seemed to stand still. The future of the city, and perhaps the nation, hung in the balance. How this confrontation played out would set the tone for everything that followed. Daniel took a deep breath, preparing to address both the marchers and the police. As he stepped forward, he caught sight of Blake in the crowd, their eyes meeting for a brief moment. In that instant, both men realized that what happened next would define not just their own futures, but the future of their community. The stage was set for a clash of ideologies, a moment of reckoning that would force everyone involved to confront their deepest beliefs and prejudices. As tension mounted, the question remained, would this be a moment of transformative change, or would it descend into chaos and further division? The air crackled with tension as the marchers faced off against the line of police officers. Daniel Johnson stood at the forefront, his hand still clasped tightly with Maya's. He could feel the energy of the crowd behind him, a mix of determination and barely contained anger. "Stay calm," he murmured to those closest to him. "We're here to make a statement, not start a war." The police line remained impassive, their riot shields creating a barrier between them and the protesters. Among them, though not immediately visible, was Captain John Blake. He had been ordered back to duty for this event, a decision that filled him with unease. As the standoff continued, voices from the crowd began to rise. Chants of "No justice, no peace," and "Black Lives Matter" echoed off the surrounding buildings. The volume increased, the peaceful protest teetering on the edge of something more volatile. Daniel knew he had to act. He turned to face the crowd, raising his free hand for silence. Gradually, the chants died down, all eyes focusing on him. "We are here today," he began, his voice carrying across the hushed gathering, "because we believe in justice. We are here because we believe that every life has value, that no one should live in fear of those sworn to protect them." As he spoke, Daniel could see the effect his words were having. The anger in the crowd was being channeled into something more powerful, a sense of unified purpose. But we are also here to show that change can happen peacefully," Daniel continued, his voice growing stronger. "We will not meet violence with violence. We will not give anyone an excuse to dismiss our message." The crowd murmured in agreement, the tension noticeably easing. Daniel turned to face the police line, his gaze sweeping across the officers. "To those of you behind the shields, we ask you to listen. We're not here as your enemies. We're here as your community, asking for accountability and change." From his position in the police line, Blake felt a conflicting mix of emotions. Part of him wanted to maintain the hard line he'd always held, but another part couldn't help but be moved by Daniel's words. As Daniel's speech continued, the atmosphere began to shift. The angry chants gave way to more positive messages of unity and change. Maya, standing beside her husband, felt a surge of pride and hope. However, just as it seemed the situation was de-escalating, a commotion erupted from the back of the crowd. A small group of protesters, faces covered, began pushing their way forward, shouting angry slogans and waving signs aggressively. "No more talk, action now," one of them yelled, their voice cutting through the relative calm that had settled over the gathering. Daniel turned, his heart sinking as he saw the potential for violence unfolding. He knew that if this situation wasn't handled carefully, everything they had worked for could be undone in a matter of moments. "Please," he called out to the advancing group, "we're here for peaceful change. This isn't the way." But his words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The agitators continued to push forward, their actions becoming more aggressive. Some began throwing water bottles and rocks towards the police line. Blake, watching the situation unfold, felt a familiar surge of adrenaline. His training told him to respond with force, to shut down the threat before it escalated further. But something held him back, the memory of Maya falling, the words Daniel had just spoken. In that moment, as the first projectiles clattered against riot shields, both Daniel and Blake found themselves at a crossroads. The decisions they made in the next few seconds would determine whether this protest remained a powerful statement for change or descended into the kind of chaos that would only reinforce the divide between law enforcement and the community. Daniel stepped forward, placing himself between the agitators and the police line. "This is not who we are," he shouted, his voice carrying over the growing noise. "We came here for justice, not violence." Meanwhile, Blake made a decision that would change the course of events. Instead of giving the order to advance and disperse the crowd, he stepped out from behind the police line, removing his riot helmet. "Stand down," he called to his fellow officers, his voice firm but calm. Then, turning to face the protesters, he spoke again. "We're here to listen. Let's talk." The crowd fell silent, stunned by this unexpected turn of events. For a moment, it seemed as if the entire city held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. In that silence, a path forward began to emerge, not one of easy answers or quick fixes, but of difficult conversations and hard-won understanding. As Daniel and Blake stood face to face in the no man's land between the two groups, the possibility of real change hung in the air, fragile but undeniably present. The tense standoff between protesters and police had reached a critical juncture. Captain John Blake, having stepped out from behind the police line, now stood exposed before the crowd. His action, removing his riot gear and calling for dialogue, had momentarily stunned both sides into silence. Daniel Johnson, equally surprised by Blake's move, recognized the opportunity it presented. He took a step forward, closing the gap between them. "Captain Blake," he said, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd, "thank you for being willing to talk. That's all we've been asking for, a chance to be heard." Blake nodded, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. "I'm listening," he said simply. As this unexpected scene unfolded, the energy of the crowd began to shift. The anger that had been building dissipated, replaced by a cautious curiosity. Even the agitators who had been pushing for confrontation seemed unsure how to respond to this turn of events. Maya, watching from a few steps behind Daniel, felt a glimmer of hope. This was the kind of moment that could change everything, if they handled it right. "Perhaps we could set up a public forum," Daniel suggested, loud enough for both Blake and the crowd to hear. "A place where community members can voice their concerns directly to law enforcement leadership." Blake considered this for a moment before responding. "That could be arranged," he said, his voice carrying a hint of uncertainty. It was clear he was navigating unfamiliar territory. As Daniel and Blake continued their impromptu negotiation, members of both the protest group and the police force watched in a mix of amazement and apprehension. This wasn't how these confrontations usually went, and no one was quite sure what to expect next. Among the protesters, whispered conversations broke out. Some expressed skepticism, viewing Blake's actions as a mere publicity stunt. Others saw it as a genuine opportunity for change. "He pushed a pregnant woman to the ground," one protester muttered. "How can we trust anything he says?" "But he's here now, trying to talk," another responded. "Isn't that what we wanted?" Similar discussions were happening among the police ranks. Some officers viewed Blake's actions as a betrayal, a capitulation to mob pressure. Others saw it as a brave attempt to bridge a widening gap between law enforcement and the community they served. As the discussions continued, both Daniel and Blake became acutely aware of the delicate nature of the situation. One wrong move, one misinterpreted word, could reignite the tensions they were trying to diffuse. "We need to move this conversation somewhere more suitable," Daniel said, glancing around at the crowd. "But we also need to show everyone here that this isn't just talk. We need concrete steps." Blake nodded, then turned to address his fellow officers. "Stand down," he ordered. "Let's show we're serious about this." Slowly, reluctantly, the police line began to relax. Shields were lowered, helmets removed. The physical barrier between the two groups began to dissolve. Seeing this, Daniel turned to the protesters. "We've been heard," he called out. "Now let's show we can respond with dignity and respect." Gradually, the crowd began to disperse. There was no great cheer of victory, no celebration. Instead, there was a sense of cautious optimism, a feeling that perhaps, just perhaps, real change was possible. As the last of the protesters left the area, Daniel, Maya, and Blake found themselves standing together, an unlikely trio united by circumstance. "This is just the beginning," Maya said, her hand resting protectively over her pregnant belly. "There's so much work to be done." Blake nodded, the weight of the situation evident in his expression. "I know," he said quietly, "and I have a lot to answer for." Daniel looked between them, the architect of change and the symbol of the system they were fighting to reform. "Then let's get to work," he said firmly. As they walked away from the scene, the city around them seemed to hold its breath. The confrontation had been averted, but the real challenge was just beginning. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with potential pitfalls and resistance from both sides. But for the first time in a long while, there was hope. Hope that meaningful dialogue could lead to real change, that the deep-seated issues plaguing the community could be addressed. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but the first step had been taken. As news of the day's events spread, people across the city and beyond watched and waited, wondering if this unlikely moment of understanding could truly be the beginning of a new chapter in the ongoing struggle for justice and equality. The days following the protest were a whirlwind of activity for Daniel Johnson, Maya, and Captain John Blake. The unexpected turn of events at the march had catapulted them into the national spotlight, with media outlets clamoring for interviews and pundits debating the significance of their impromptu dialogue. Daniel found himself juggling his senatorial duties with his new role as a bridge between the community and law enforcement. He spent hours in meetings with community leaders, trying to channel the energy of the protest into concrete plans for reform. "We can't let this moment slip away," he told a group of activists gathered in his office. "We need to strike while the iron is hot, push for real, systemic changes." Maya, despite her pregnancy, threw herself into organizing community forums. She became a powerful voice, sharing her story and encouraging others to speak out about their experiences with law enforcement. "It's not just about me anymore," she told a group of women at a community center. "It's about making sure no one else has to go through what I did." Meanwhile, Blake found himself in uncharted territory. His actions at the protest had made him a controversial figure within the police force. Some viewed him as a traitor, while others saw him as a necessary agent of change. In a tense meeting with the police chief and other high-ranking officers, Blake stood his ground. "We can't keep doing things the same way and expect different results," he argued. "We need to rebuild trust with the community we're supposed to serve." As plans for the public forum took shape, tensions in the city remained high. The initial optimism following the protest began to give way to skepticism and impatience. Many in the community wanted to see immediate action, not just promises of future change. On social media, the hashtag #WaitingForJustice started trending, with people sharing stories of police misconduct and demanding accountability. The pressure on both Daniel and Blake to deliver tangible results was immense. The night before the scheduled forum, Daniel sat in his study, poring over notes and proposals. Maya entered, carrying 2 cups of tea. "You need to rest," she said gently, setting a cup beside him. Daniel looked up, the fatigue evident in his eyes. "There's so much riding on this, Maya. If we can't show real progress..." Maya placed a hand on his shoulder. "We will, but change doesn't happen overnight. We're laying the groundwork for something big." Across town, Blake sat alone in his apartment, staring at his police badge. The weight of his past actions and the uncertainty of the future weighed heavily on him. He picked up his phone, hesitating for a moment, before dialing. "Senator Johnson, it's Blake. I think I need to make a public apology at the forum. For what happened to your wife, and for all the times I might have abused my authority without even realizing it." The day of the forum dawned bright and clear. The community center where it was being held was packed to capacity, with overflow crowds gathering outside. The air was thick with anticipation and unspoken tension. As Daniel stepped up to the podium to open the proceedings, he saw faces filled with hope, skepticism, anger, and fear. He took a deep breath, acutely aware that what happened in the next few hours could set the tone for his city's future. "We're here today not just to talk, but to listen," he began. "To acknowledge past wrongs and to work together towards a better future." As he spoke, he caught sight of Maya in the front row, her hand resting protectively on her belly. Their eyes met, and he drew strength from her unwavering support. Then, it was Blake's turn to speak. The room fell silent as he approached the microphone, the weight of expectation palpable. "I stand before you today not just as a police officer, but as a member of this community," he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "And I owe you all an apology." As Blake spoke, laying bare his mistakes and his commitment to change, the atmosphere in the room began to shift. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start, a willingness to listen, to consider the possibility of transformation. The forum stretched on for hours, with community members stepping up to share their stories, their fears, and their hopes. It was raw, emotional, and at times uncomfortable. But it was also, undeniably, a step forward. As the event drew to a close, Daniel, Maya, and Blake found themselves standing together once again. They exchanged glances, each aware that this was just the beginning of a long and difficult journey. "We've opened the door," Daniel said quietly. "Now we have to make sure it stays open." Maya nodded, her expression determined. "And we have to make sure everyone has a chance to walk through it." Blake, his face etched with the weight of the day's emotions, simply nodded. He knew his hardest work was still ahead of him. As they left the community center, stepping out into the fading light of day, they were met with a mix of cheers and continued calls for action. The path forward was far from clear, but for the first time in a long while, it felt like real change might be possible. The city held its breath, waiting to see what would come next in this unexpected journey towards justice and reconciliation. In the weeks following the community forum, the city found itself in a state of cautious optimism, tinged with impatience. The frank discussions and promises made at the event had sparked hope, but people were eager to see concrete actions. Daniel Johnson, now thrust into the role of de facto leader of the reform movement, felt the weight of expectations heavily. He spent his days in a whirlwind of meetings, phone calls, and strategy sessions, trying to translate the community's demands into actionable policies. One morning, as he reviewed a draft of proposed police reforms in his office, his chief of staff burst in, looking flustered. "Senator, you need to see this," she said, handing him a tablet. Daniel's heart sank as he read the headline, "Police Union Pushes Back Against Reforms, Calls for Captain Blake's Resignation." The article detailed how a significant faction within the police force viewed Blake's actions as a betrayal. They were mobilizing to resist the proposed changes and demanding that Blake step down for undermining the authority of law enforcement. As Daniel absorbed this news, his phone buzzed with a message from Maya. "Have you seen the news? We need to talk." Across town, John Blake sat in a quiet corner of a local diner, nursing a cold cup of coffee. The past few weeks had been a roller coaster of emotions and revelations. He'd spent countless hours in discussions with community members, listening to their stories and confronting the harsh realities of how his actions and those of his fellow officers had impacted lives. Now, faced with the backlash from his own colleagues, Blake found himself at a crossroads. Part of him wanted to retreat, to go back to the certainty of his old life, but he knew there was no going back. He had seen too much, understood too much. His phone buzzed, a message from Daniel. "We need to meet, my office 1 hour." As Blake made his way to the senator's office, the streets were abuzz with activity. News of the police union's stance had spread quickly, reigniting tensions that had only just begun to simmer down. When he arrived, he found not just Daniel, but Maya as well, her presence a stark reminder of how this all began. "John," Daniel said, his voice grave, "we've got a situation on our hands." Blake nodded, his expression weary but determined. "I know. The union's making their move." "We can't let them derail this," Maya interjected, her hand resting on her now visible baby bump. "Too many people are counting on us." The three of them spent the next few hours strategizing, trying to find a way to keep the reform efforts on track without fracturing the police force entirely. It was a delicate balance, pushing for necessary changes, while also acknowledging the concerns of officers who felt threatened by the new direction. As their discussion wound down, Blake made a decision. "I need to address the force directly," he said. "If I can get enough officers to see why these changes are necessary, we might have a chance." Daniel and Maya exchanged glances. It was a risky move, but they both recognized the potential impact. "Do it," Daniel said finally, "but be careful." We can't afford to lose you in this fight." The next day, Blake stood before a packed auditorium of police officers. The tension in the room was palpable, with many of his colleagues viewing him with open hostility. "I know many of you feel betrayed," he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "You think I've turned my back on you on the badge. But the truth is, I've never been more committed to what that badge really means." As Blake spoke, sharing stories of the community members he'd met and the impact of overly aggressive policing, he could see the expressions of some officers beginning to shift. Not all, many remained stone-faced and angry, but enough to give him hope. Meanwhile, Daniel and Maya worked tirelessly to keep the community engaged and patient. They organized town halls, met with activist groups, and pushed for transparency in the reform process. At one such meeting, an elderly woman stood up, her voice quavering with emotion. "My grandson was killed by police 5 years ago," she said. "How do I know this time will be any different?" The room fell silent, all eyes on Daniel and Maya. It was Maya who spoke first, her hand instinctively going to her belly. "Because this time, we're not letting go," she said firmly. "This time, we're holding everyone accountable, the police, the politicians, and ourselves. And we're not stopping until we see real change." As the days passed, the city remained on edge, caught between hope for change and fear of disappointment. The push for police reform had become a daily topic of conversation in homes, workplaces, and on street corners. Daniel, Maya, and Blake found themselves at the center of a storm, each facing unique challenges. Daniel worked tirelessly in the political arena, navigating the complex web of city politics to push through reform legislation. Maya became a powerful voice for victims of police brutality, her own experience lending weight to her words. Blake, meanwhile, continued his efforts to change the culture within the police force, facing resistance, but also finding unexpected allies. One evening, as Daniel was leaving his office after another long day, he was confronted by a group of angry police officers and their families. "You're destroying our livelihoods," one shouted. "Who's going to protect the city if you tie our hands?" Daniel took a deep breath, reminding himself of the importance of dialogue. "I understand your concerns," he began, his voice calm but firm. "But these reforms aren't about tying your hands. They're about building trust, about making sure everyone in our community feels safe, including you." As he spoke, he could see some of the anger in their eyes give way to uncertainty. It wasn't agreement, not yet, but it was a start. Across town, Maya was speaking at a community center, addressing a room full of young people. "Your voices matter," she told them, her hand resting on her growing belly. "This fight isn't just about what happened to me. It's about creating a future where all of you can walk the streets without fear." As she finished speaking, a young man stood up, his expression a mix of hope and skepticism. "But how do we know the police will actually change? Words are easy, but action is hard." Maya nodded, acknowledging the validity of his concern. "You're right," she said. "That's why we're not just asking for change. We're demanding it, and we're holding everyone accountable. But for this to work, we need you too. We need you to stay engaged, to keep pushing, to be the change you want to see." Meanwhile, Blake was facing his own battles within the police department. He had just finished a tense meeting with the police union representatives, who were pushing back hard against the proposed reforms. As he left the meeting room, a young officer approached him. "Captain," she said hesitantly, "I just wanted to say, I think you're doing the right thing. A lot of us do, even if we're afraid to say it out loud." Blake felt a glimmer of hope at her words. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "It's not easy, but it's necessary. We can't keep pretending there isn't a problem." As the weeks turned into months, small but significant changes began to take shape. Body cameras became mandatory for all officers on duty. A civilian oversight board was established to review complaints against the police. Training programs were overhauled to include de-escalation techniques and implicit bias awareness. Each change was met with a mix of celebration and skepticism from the community, and varying degrees of resistance from within the police force. But slowly, incrementally, progress was being made. One afternoon, Daniel, Maya, and Blake met in Daniel's office to discuss the latest developments. The room was littered with papers, draft legislation, community feedback reports, training proposals. "It's not enough," Maya said, frustration evident in her voice. "People are still being harassed, still being profiled. We need to do more." Daniel nodded, running a hand through his hair. "I know, but we have to be careful. Push too hard, too fast, and we risk losing everything we've gained." Blake, who had been quiet, finally spoke up. "What if we could show them? Not just tell them about the changes, but let them see for themselves." Daniel and Maya looked at him curiously. "What do you mean?" Daniel asked. "A ride-along program," Blake explained. "Not just for politicians or journalists, but for community members. Let them see what we do, day in and day out, and in return, have officers spend time in the community, not as law enforcement, but as neighbors." The idea sparked a long discussion, weighing the potential benefits against the risks. But by the end of the meeting, they had the beginnings of a plan. As they prepared to leave, Maya suddenly winced, her hand going to her stomach. "Maya?" Daniel said, alarm in his voice. "Is everything okay?" She nodded, a small smile on her face despite the discomfort. I think it's time. The baby's coming." In that moment, as they rushed to the hospital, the larger fight for justice and reform faded into the background. They were reminded of the very personal stakes in their struggle, the hope for a better future, not just for their community, but for the next generation. As Maya was wheeled into the delivery room, Daniel by her side, Blake waited in the hospital corridor. He found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them all to this point. The pain, the anger, the difficult conversations, the small victories, and the ongoing challenges. He realized that in many ways this moment, the birth of Daniel and Maya's child, was a powerful symbol of what they were fighting for. A future full of possibility, unmarred by the prejudices and injustices of the past. As the hours ticked by, Blake made a silent promise. To the child about to enter the world, to Daniel and Maya, and to himself, he would not give up. No matter how difficult the road ahead might be, he would continue to work for change, to strive for a world where every child could grow up feeling safe and valued. The sound of a baby's cry echoed through the hospital corridor, a new life entering a world in the midst of transformation. It was a reminder of why their fight mattered, and the birth of Daniel and Maya's daughter, whom they named Hope, marked a new chapter in their lives and in the ongoing struggle for police reform. As news of the birth spread, it seemed to reignite the community's determination for change, serving as a powerful symbol of the future they were all fighting for. In the weeks that followed, while Maya recovered and bonded with their newborn, Daniel found himself juggling his responsibilities as a new father, a senator, and a leader in the reform movement. The sleepless nights spent caring for Hope gave him a new perspective on the urgency of their cause. One morning, as Daniel cradled Hope in his office between meetings, his chief of staff burst in with breaking news. "Senator, you need to see this," she said, handing him a tablet. The headline made his heart sink. "Internal investigation reveals Captain Blake's history of excessive force complaints." The article detailed a series of incidents throughout Blake's career, painting a picture of an officer who had repeatedly used questionable tactics and excessive force, particularly in encounters with minorities. Many of these incidents had been quietly swept under the rug or dismissed without thorough investigation. Daniel felt a mix of shock and betrayal. He had come to see Blake as a crucial ally in their fight for reform. Now, it seemed that the very issues they were fighting against were deeply rooted in Blake's own past. Across town, Blake sat in his apartment, staring at his phone as it buzzed incessantly with messages and calls. He had known this day might come, but facing the reality of his past laid bare for all to see was still overwhelming. As the story gained traction, the city once again found itself in turmoil. Protesters took to the streets, demanding Blake's immediate dismissal and questioning the sincerity of the entire reform effort. The police union, seeing an opportunity, renewed their calls for a halt to the reforms. Maya, still recovering at home with hope, watched the unfolding events with a growing sense of dread. When Daniel finally returned home that evening, exhaustion and worry etched on his face. She knew they were at a crossroads. "What are we going to do?" she asked softly, hope sleeping peacefully in her arms. Daniel sank into a chair, running his hands through his hair. "I don't know," he admitted. "If we stand by Blake, we risk losing all credibility with the community. If we cut ties with him, the reform effort might fall apart." As they discussed their options late into the night, they realized that this crisis, as difficult as it was, also presented an opportunity. It was a chance to demonstrate their commitment to transparency and accountability, starting with one of their own. The next morning, Daniel called a press conference. With Maya by his side, hope cradled in her arms, he addressed the gathered crowd of journalists and concerned citizens. "We've always said that true reform requires honesty, accountability, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths," he began. "Today, we're faced with one of those truths, and how we respond will define the future of our efforts." He went on to announce a full independent investigation into Blake's record, as well as a broader audit of complaint histories for all officers in the department. "We cannot ask for accountability without being willing to hold ourselves to the same standard," he declared. As Daniel spoke, Blake watched the press conference on TV, a mix of emotions washing over him. Part of him wanted to resign, to remove himself from the equation. But another part, the part that had driven him to support the reforms in the first place, knew that running away wasn't the answer. With a deep breath, he picked up his phone and dialed Daniel's number. When the senator answered, Blake's voice was steady. "I want to cooperate fully with the investigation," he said, "and I want to address the community directly. They deserve to hear the truth from me." In the days that followed, the city watched as Blake's past was laid bare. In a series of public forums, he faced the community he had sworn to protect, acknowledging his mistakes and the harm he had caused. It was a painful process, filled with raw emotions and difficult confrontations. Many called for his resignation, seeing his past actions as unforgivable. Others, however, saw his willingness to face his mistakes head-on as a sign of genuine change. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that Blake's case was not unique. The audit revealed a pattern of similar incidents throughout the department, highlighting the systemic nature of the problem they were facing. This revelation, while disturbing, provided new momentum for the reform efforts. It underscored the need for comprehensive change, not just in policies and procedures, but in the very culture of law enforcement. Daniel and Maya found themselves working harder than ever, using the increased attention to push for even more sweeping reforms. They proposed changes to hiring practices, expanded community oversight, and increased funding for de-escalation training and mental health support for officers. Throughout it all, they kept hope close, her presence a constant reminder of why their fight mattered. In quiet moments between meetings and public appearances, they would look at their daughter, imagining the world they wanted her to grow up in. As the weeks turned into months, the city began to see small but significant changes. The number of use-of-force incidents decreased. Community engagement programs flourished. A new sense of cautious optimism began to take hold. One evening, as Daniel and Maya walked through their neighborhood, Hope asleep in her stroller, they were approached by an elderly woman. "I've been watching what you're doing," she said, her eyes filled with a mix of hope and wariness born from years of disappointment. "It's not perfect, and we've got a long way to go. But for the first time in a long time, I feel like maybe, just maybe, things might actually change." As they continued their walk, Daniel and Maya exchanged a glance. They knew the woman was right. The road ahead was long and fraught with challenges. But they were committed to seeing it through, not just for Hope, but for every member of their community who deserved to feel safe and valued. The sun was setting as they made their way home, casting a warm glow over the city. It was a reminder that even after the darkest nights, a new day always dawns, bringing with it the possibility of change and the hope for a better future. The final act of this tumultuous journey unfolded on a crisp autumn morning, exactly 1 year after the incident that had set everything in motion. The City Hall auditorium was packed to capacity, a sea of faces reflecting the diversity of the community. At the front of the room sat Daniel, Maya, and their now 1-year-old daughter, Hope. The occasion was a public hearing, the culmination of months of investigations, reforms, and heated debates. Captain John Blake, looking older and more weathered than he had a year ago, sat at a table facing the gathered crowd. As the hearing began, Daniel stood to address the assembly. "A year ago," he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion, "we stood on the brink of chaos. Today, we gather not to assign blame or seek retribution, but to acknowledge our past, confront our present, and chart a course for our future." He went on to outline the changes that had been implemented over the past year: the new oversight committee, the revised training programs, the community engagement initiatives. But he also acknowledged the work that still needed to be done. "We've made progress," he said, "but we're far from finished. True change takes time, effort, and an unwavering commitment from all of us." As Daniel took his seat, Maya stood, cradling Hope in her arms. The room fell silent as she began to speak. "A year ago, I was a victim," she said, her voice strong despite the emotion behind her words. "Today, I stand before you not just as a survivor, but as a mother, a community member, and an advocate for change." She spoke of the fear she had felt, the anger and despair that had followed. But she also spoke of hope. Hope for a future where her daughter and all children could grow up feeling safe and valued, regardless of the color of their skin. As Maya concluded her speech, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. The personal cost of their struggle, embodied in the small child in her arms, was a powerful reminder of what was at stake. Then it was Blake's turn to speak. He stood slowly, the weight of the past year evident in every movement. He faced the crowd, his expression a mix of remorse and determination. "I stand before you today, not to make excuses, but to take responsibility," he began. "For my actions that day, and for every time I failed to live up to the oath I swore to serve and protect." Blake went on to detail the journey he had undergone over the past year, the painful self-reflection, the confrontations with those he had wronged, the struggle to change not just his actions, but his fundamental understanding of his role as a police officer. "I can't undo the harm I've caused," he said, his voice breaking slightly, "but I can dedicate the rest of my career, the rest of my life, to doing better, to being better." As Blake spoke, the atmosphere in the room began to shift. The anger and skepticism that had greeted him at the start of the hearing began to give way to something else. Not forgiveness, perhaps, but a cautious willingness to believe in the possibility of change. When Blake finished speaking, the floor was opened for community members to share their thoughts and experiences. For hours, people came forward, victims of police brutality, officers struggling with the changing landscape of their profession, activists who had fought for years for the changes now being implemented. The stories were raw, emotional, and often difficult to hear, but they were also filled with a tentative hope, a sense that perhaps finally, real change was possible. As the hearing drew to a close, Daniel stood once more. "What we've heard today is just the beginning," he said. "The road ahead will be long and difficult. There will be setbacks and disappointments. But if we remain committed, if we continue to listen to each other and work together, I believe we can create the kind of community we all deserve." The crowd rose to their feet, a spontaneous standing ovation that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. It wasn't an ending, far from it, but it was a powerful affirmation of how far they had come and a promise to continue the work that lay ahead. As people began to file out of the auditorium, Daniel, Maya, and Blake found themselves standing together, much as they had a year ago on that tense street corner. "So," Maya said, bouncing hope gently in her arms, "what now?" Daniel looked out at the dispersing crowd, a mix of determination and hope in his eyes. "Now," he said, "we keep going. We keep pushing for change, keep holding ourselves and others accountable. We don't stop until every member of our community feels safe, valued, and heard." Blake nodded, a newfound resolve in his bearing. "It won't be easy," he said, "but nothing worth doing ever is." As they walked out into the bright autumn sunlight, they were met with a mix of cheers and continued calls for action from the gathered crowd. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, it felt like they were truly on the right path. Hope, oblivious to the weight of the moment, let out a happy gurgle. Maya smiled down at her daughter, then looked up at Daniel and Blake. "For her," she said simply, "for all of them." The three of them nodded in silent agreement. They had come so far, but there was still much work to be done. As they stepped forward into the crowd, ready to continue their fight for justice and equality, they carried with them the hopes and dreams of an entire community and the promise of a better future for all.